Veronica was sitting in the kitchen and didn't want to go anywhere. Her son's wife was about to come, and she didn't want to see her, didn't want to talk to her. Lately, their relationship was so bad that they both could barely stand each other. Although Veronica was always willing to compromise, Sarah didn't want to accept her conditions, or at least coexist peacefully. Every time she came home, she put her hair in a high ponytail, put on a silk robe, and turned into a real witch, always ready to attack the poor old lady. Veronica looked out the window, not because she liked the beautiful autumn scenery, but because she knew that her son's wife was about to come. Sometimes she wanted to go back to her native village, but she couldn't afford that. Her son took her to the big city, and she had to stay here so he could repair that house, as he had promised. And then she would go back home. But even though Veronica expected to return the same year, all her calculations turned out to be wrong. She was sure it would take about a month or two to repair the house. But then the deadline was changed, again and again, and she stayed here. Veronica saw a tall girl approaching the building. She was arguing with someone on the phone, which was absolutely normal. Veronica grimaced. She knew her daughter-in-law would be home in a few minutes. She wished Sarah would go into the store right now, or talk on the phone just a little longer, so the poor old lady could have some more time in peace and quiet. But as luck would have it, Sarah wasn't going to the store. She walked toward the entrance, dropped the phone call, looked up, and waved to Veronica. It was as if Sarah was mocking her. Veronica felt that this situation was escalating, and the longer she lived here, the worse it got. She needed to talk to her son so he could help her, so he would bring her home, even if the repairs weren't finished there. "So, how was your day? I see you did nothing today and just sat idly staring out the window. We didn't bring you from the village to be lazy and do nothing all day long," said Sarah. "But I do laundry, I clean your apartment, I cook for you, I take care of you. Why are you telling me again that I don't do anything? Anyway, there's nothing to talk about, it's useless. You will always think of me as a slacker and blame me for everything," the woman said, but she tried very hard to control herself. "I don't think cooking dinner tired you out," Sarah said. Veronica grimaced, realizing it would be impossible to explain anything to her. "Your son and I are working hard to repair your house and to make your life more comfortable. Yes, you cook and clean, but you also live in our apartment at our expense. So be grateful and show some respect," Sarah said. She smiled in triumph, but her face expressed some strange emotions. She couldn't stand her husband's mother, though Veronica never fought with her much or tried to hurt her. Well, at least not until Sarah started the quarrel first again. Sarah was a very scandalous and rude girl, so it wasn't surprising that almost every conversation they had ended in a fight. They could argue until late at night, or rather, Sarah yelled and quarreled with Veronica, and the old woman only endured it. She ignored all her insults and tried to pretend she was not involved in this argument. "You know, you and I fight all the time, and there's actually a reason I can't stand you," Sarah confessed honestly. Veronica was surprised because she had not expected such honesty from Sarah. "Your son and I have a family, and we are working, and you could give us this house in the village, but you don't want to do it. You are already old, and you are only disturbing us here. You could move to some nursing home and wait for your death there. In that case, we would have our own house. I'm not old. When you're my age, you'll realize that even at my age, people want to live, Veronica said. I'd love to go and live somewhere else, but it's a little early for me to go to a nursing home. Sarah frowned, wanting to say something. But then the front door opened. Albert entered the apartment. He looked exhausted. He was pale, and obviously, he had enough problems, so he didn't want to get into this quarrel. Albert, your mom is making a scene again, Sarah said, not taking her eyes off Veronica, who got used to the fact that Sarah was always setting her up. We work hard. We are tired every day, and she is always at home doing nothing and arguing all the time. Sarah, let's talk later. At least let me take a shower, Albert said. He was so tired, so miserable, that his mother got worried about him. She had never seen him like this before. Veronica felt very sorry for Albert, considering the difficult situation he was facing these days. It was hard for him to struggle with the difficulties he was going through. Besides, his mother sensed that he was hiding something from his wife. And maybe he was hiding something from his mother, too. And it was hurting him from the inside, not allowing him to live a normal life. While you're taking a shower, she'll keep insulting me, Sarah said quietly. She immediately corrected herself, said the phrase again, and now stared at her spouse. She waited for him to say something, to scold his mother, but he remained silent. Sarah, I'm sick and tired of your lies. Aren't you ashamed? Nobody hurts you. As soon as you come home from work, you start arguing with me. And then as soon as my son comes home, you start saying that I started a quarrel, that I insulted you. Veronica couldn't stand it anymore, feeling like a stranger in this house. Look, you're adults. Can't you finally have a normal conversation, solve all your problems and make peace? Stop fighting. Do I have to make peace between you all the time? Sit down, talk, sort everything out, discuss, find a compromise. And that's it, Albert said sharply, clearly unhappy that he had to explain such basic things to mature people. He turned around and left for the balcony, where he spent a lot of time. There was his small office, with a desk and a computer, and where the night city outside the windows relaxed him, allowing him to focus on his work. He was sick of the scandals, but he was even more sick of the problems that haunted him. He tried to solve all these problems, but the situation worsened, and he realized that it would probably be almost impossible to get out of it alone. When the door opened quietly, he immediately knew it was his mom. Sarah would always come in with a great noise, never knocking at his office, and start setting up her rules. But his mom would always come in very quietly, knocking on the door, apologizing before she entered. He looked at her with a tired, weary look. Her worries about her son only increased. Mom, I have so many problems, and you're only making it worse, he said, looking at her. I don't know how to solve all these problems. When I come home, I really want to have some rest, but all I hear is you arguing. Listen, son, why don't you take me back to the village? I don't care if the repairs are unfinished. I'll live in my own house, and I won't be a burden to you. You'll have fewer scandals here. I can't find common ground with Sarah. I don't even understand how to talk to her, because she makes it seem like I'm arguing with her. But in fact, she's bullying me every day. At my age, I need peace. I can take care of myself. Just take me back home, Veronica said, trying to speak quietly and calmly, to be careful in her choice of words. Albert looked at his mother, not knowing how to explain that he simply could not take her to her house. He clenched his cheekbones, and she could tell from his behavior that something was wrong, and she didn't know anything about it yet. She looked at him carefully, but he only glanced at her and shook his head negatively. She could see that he was preparing for a very unpleasant conversation. She sat down next to him in a chair to make it easier for him to talk, and he glanced at the door, trying to determine whether his wife was listening. But then the phone rang. He heard footsteps and the annoyed voice of his wife, who was talking to someone aggressively. It was the perfect time to talk. "Mom, I'll tell you something, but you have to promise not to say anything to my wife. You know how she reacts to everything. I don't want to get involved in all this again to start another quarrel, especially since no quarrel will fix the situation now," Albert said tiredly. And she nodded, still looking at him anxiously. "I got into a very unpleasant situation. I needed some money, so I lied to you. I didn't go to your house to repair it. I sold it. Sorry, but you don't have a house anymore, because I needed a lot of money." She looked at her son and couldn't believe her ears. She couldn't understand why he had suddenly decided that he had the right to leave her without a home, just to solve his problems. All this time, while she had been living with her son, she had thought she had a home where she could always return, not to mention that her house kept many memories that she loved and cherished so much. And now it turns out that she has absolutely nothing? She had nowhere to go back to. And besides, the rude girl who was yelling at someone on the phone right now was not even aware of what was going on. Veronica knew that most of the abuse from the girl was exactly because she wanted to get her house. "I have nothing to say. You disappointed me, son," she said, honestly, and then, barely holding back the tears, added, "You have to tell your wife anyway. She hates me just because I didn't give you this house. I know, I'm trying to postpone this moment as far away as possible. Actually, I think that maybe Sarah and I won't live together for more than a year," Albert said, and she could hear the fatigue in his voice. She stroked her son's head, seeing how sad and weak he was. But she was very offended. After all, he had gotten into this money shortage situation himself, and should have solved it on his own, not at the expense of his mother's property. Would she really have to go to the nursing home now? She wasn't afraid of going to that place, but she hoped she would end up there much later. She wanted to enjoy life in her house, spend time in the garden, and drink tea on the terrace. But her son deprived her of that opportunity. "I'm not going to apologize. Let me be honest with you. I think I did the right thing. If I hadn't sold your house, I would be dead," Albert said, taking out his cigarettes, lighting one and talking with a cigarette in his teeth. "It was my fault that I got involved in this situation, but I have to get out of this, no matter what it costs me." His mother only shook her head in the negative, and then walked out, leaving him alone. She didn't know what he would be thinking about, what would be going on in his head. All she knew was that she was disappointed in him and that she had never expected him to do such a despicable act. It was very sad and difficult for her to accept that her home, which she loved so much, was now left completely abandoned, unneeded by anyone. Or maybe it would even be demolished. She grew up in that house, raised her children there, and lived there in happiness until her husband passed away, until the children grew up, moved away, and her son got married to such a strange woman who could not find common ground with anyone. Veronica went into the living room and lay down on the couch to try to fall asleep, or at least pretend she was asleep, so that Sarah wouldn't bother her. The next morning, she felt worse. Her heart was pounding fast, and she was sweating and freezing again. "You don't look well," Sarah said as she got ready for work. "Should we call you an ambulance?" "No, it's just my old age. Don't worry about it," Veronica said. Sarah asked about her health, but there was no sincerity in what she said. She was only saying it because her husband was around. If he had already left for work by this time, she would not have even noticed Veronica's condition. Veronica hoped that her condition would get better. She thought she would feel better the next day. But with each passing day, the situation worsened. She realized that something bad was happening to her. She felt like she was getting weaker, getting worse by the day. "Yes, this dose is over. I need more," Veronica heard through her sleep. Sarah's voice sounded very quiet. She was almost whispering. But since she was very nervous, her voice echoed through the empty apartment, as if she were speaking into a loudspeaker. She probably didn't even notice it because of her nervousness. Veronica slightly rose on the couch. She wanted to get up, but she knew that as soon as she got up, the couch would creak. Besides, she was dizzy and couldn't even walk to the bathroom without holding on to the walls. "I don't know. I expected it to be done by now, but you turned out to be stronger than I thought," Sarah said frustratedly. And everything became clear. Veronica realized that her daughter-in-law was poisoning her, and she didn't even know what poison it was. But it was clear that the longer she stayed here, the worse her condition would become, until she finally died. Veronica lay down again. She thought that if she was conscious tomorrow, if she didn't eat or drink anything, maybe she could call an ambulance as soon as Sarah and her son left for work. She decided not to tell her son about it, because he wouldn't believe her anyway. He would only justify his spouse again. The next morning, as soon as Sarah left for work, outraged that Veronica refused to drink the water she gave her, Albert's mother started looking for her phone. But Sarah must have taken all the phones, and there wasn't a single device to call from. Veronica felt like she was about to pass out. She left the apartment, knocked on the door next door, and managed only to say that she needed an ambulance, and then lost consciousness. She woke up in the emergency room, but the doctors who surrounded her added something to her IV again, and she passed out again. Someone kept telling her something, but she was barely conscious. As if through a white veil, she saw doctors, nurses, and all of them running around her, apparently trying to get her back from the afterlife. The next time Veronica woke up, she was lying in her room. There was no fuss around her, and she stared up at the snow-white ceiling, which gleamed pleasantly, reflecting the rays of sunlight that fell through the windows. "Wow, I thought you wouldn't wake up. I'm sorry to say this, but your condition was very bad. You had severe poisoning. At your age, it's almost fatal. Okay, I'm going to call your children. They can take you home now." "No, please don't," Veronica protested. "I'm begging you, I can't go home. Tell my children that I'm dead. Otherwise, if I go home, I will really die." The doctor stared at her, unsure what to do in such a situation. He wanted to leave the room and talk to his colleagues, but the old woman immediately raised her arm, trying to get up, and the doctor rushed over to her so that she wouldn't do it. "Tell them I'm dead. I'm begging you. And when they come here, tell them I willed myself to science, so that's why they can't get my body and bury me. I don't have any inheritance, so they can't expect anything either. I'll give you my bank card to pay for the room for now. Meanwhile, I'll figure out what to do," said Veronica. The doctor, who looked at her with bewilderment, felt pity and sympathy for her. He was also afraid that when he became old, his children would abandon him, and he would have to hide in the hospital, and then come home in fear where he might be poisoned for the sake of the inheritance. Veronica noticed that her mind was working perfectly, and that she felt much better without all the medications Sarah had been giving her. She was lying in her room, wondering how her son would take the news. But at the same time, she knew that he would barely react at all, because the most important thing for him was to please his wife, even if it cost his mother her life. Besides, as it turned out, she was in the hospital not for a couple of hours, as she thought, but for a couple of days. But neither her son nor Sarah had ever come to see her. They didn't even call her to ask how she was doing. It hurt her that her children were so cruel. But she had already accepted it and forced herself to focus on finding a solution for where she was going to go after she got out of the hospital. Because otherwise, she will be homeless. When Albert entered the hospital, he didn't know what to expect. But he hoped that a doctor would tell him that his mother was gone, that he was sorry, and all that sort of thing. He was tired of enduring constant scandals from his mother and his wife. He would feel much better now if his mother would rest in peace. Then he wouldn't have to listen to his wife or his mother's indignation about the house he sold. He was extremely tired. He could hardly stand on his feet. But he had come to hear the news that might have made him happy. "I think the best outcome for us right now would be if she didn't wake up there," Sarah said honestly, choosing her words carefully so her husband wouldn't guess that it was her fault that his mother was in the hospital. Except that Sarah had initially hoped for a very different outcome. She had hoped that Veronica would get straight from their apartment to the funeral agency, and then to the cemetery, but not to the hospital. Sarah realized that Veronica understood what was going on, so she left the apartment and went to their neighbor to call an ambulance. But she also knew that despite what was going on, the old woman would not go to the police. Sarah knew that Veronica loved her son and would not ruin his life. When the doctor came and told them that his mother had died, Albert looked at him dumbfounded, not letting a single tear fall. But Sarah, apparently thinking it was the right time to practice her drama skills, began to show crying and moaning, and even the doctor, who didn't really care, saw that everything was fake. Albert was confused, looking at his spouse, but Sarah was sure she was an excellent actress, and her emotions looked realistic. "Enough, Sarah. Go to the car," Albert said. And now, realizing how ridiculous she had looked all this time, she immediately turned sharply and walked toward the car. She tapped her sharp heels, making an unpleasant sound. "When can we get the body for the funeral?" Albert said, still looking at the doctor, who immediately realized that the old lady definitely didn't want to come back to this family. Not only because of her daughter-in-law, but because of her son's indifference. "She willed her body to science, so you don't have to bother with the funeral. If you need a death certificate, you'll have to wait at least a couple of months. You know, there were so many poisons in her blood, so we have to figure it all out," the doctor said. Albert nodded and walked out of the hospital. He didn't need that certificate, because there was no inheritance anymore. He had already sold the only valuable thing they could have inherited. Unfortunately, his mother had nothing else. He began to think about what he should do now, and how to pay off his debts. But the fact that there would be no more scandals and quarrels at home made him very happy, even though he had lost his mother. When Albert got into the car, his wife was very nervous. Albert exhaled, leaned back in the car seat, and felt a headache. He didn't want to talk to his wife right now. He didn't want to discuss his mother's death. And he was afraid that his wife would start a conversation about the inheritance she had been waiting for. Look, let's put it this way. I know you want to talk, but let's wait till we get home. I have a terrible headache, and if you mess with me, trust me, you won't like the consequences, Albert warned her. She nodded, clearly not going to talk now. She wanted to come home, have a drink, and just calm down. There was so much positive emotion boiling inside her that she didn't even know how to calm down, and she didn't know how much longer she would enjoy this experience. But one thing was clear. Everything in her life would now work out just the way she had planned. She couldn't believe that now they would have a house and move to the countryside. She'd be able to start her own small business, earn decent money, and be busy all the time. Or maybe, on the contrary, she'd make her husband work, while she would not do anything, only take care of herself. She looked forward to a happy future. The rest of her life flashed before her eyes as if it wasn't important anymore. Her husband saw her joyful face, and vague doubts came to his mind. Suddenly, he supposed that his wife was to blame for his mother being in the ICU. But no matter what, he wasn't going to deal with it. Anyway, the police will not prove anything, which means his wife was safe, and he could finally have some peace of mind. By the time they got home, his wife had calmed down a bit, but she still couldn't hide the cheerful expression on her face. She was literally glowing with happiness, and he could see that the death of his mother was good for her, no matter how creepy it sounded. Now we'll do the paperwork, get the inheritance, and that's it. We can relax and live happily. We'll move into this huge house or sell it for some crazy money, considering how ancient and beautiful it is. A real work of architectural art. We'll get so much money, we can start a business and stop living from paycheck to paycheck. I can't even imagine how luxurious our lives will become, Sarah said. She took off her coat and her shoes and laid down on the sofa with her legs up. She was smiling and giggling as she looked at her husband, but she could see that his face was gloomy. However, she thought it was grief, and she had no idea what he was going to tell her now. He sat down next to her, and she still looked straight into his eyes and continued to smile, hoping that her smile would make him smile, too. Okay, there's no point in hiding anything now. There is no inheritance, he said, trying not to look at her. What do you mean, no inheritance? She asked, and the smile instantly disappeared. She looked at him, and he, realizing there was no turning back, went on talking. When I took my mother to the city, I didn't make any repairs to that house. I got into trouble. I had a lot of debts, and I sold that house to pay off the debts. And the money I allegedly spent on repairs, it wasn't for repairs. It was to pay off debts, he said, seeing her face change with every word he said. At first, she looked at him as if with doubt. Then there was confusion, and then anger, which was the most dangerous for him. He knew that this conversation would end in nothing without a scandal, and so he prepared to withstand her attack. But Snow, she was only looking at him, apparently trying to understand what had happened. Or maybe trying to accept the fact that this nightmare was real. Do I understand correctly that all this time, while I was fighting with your mother for our inheritance, you sold the house? She said calmly. But he could see she was getting angry. He remained silent. After all, silence was the safest option right now. She stood up, looking at him, still not believing her ears. She swallowed, and he realized that her condition was only getting worse. If he didn't talk to her now, she would explode with anger. You don't understand what a terrible situation I was in. You have no idea how hard it was for me and that I was fighting for my life. Do you even realize how hard it was for me? He asked, starting to yell at her to make her feel guilty about everything. But although she was an emotional person, it was not easy to make her feel guilty, just because she knew she was not guilty of anything. I don't care. Do you even know the step I took to get this inheritance? I have committed a terrible sin for the sake of our future. I thought we'd sell this house or move into it, change our life somehow. And it turns out that you sold that house secretly from me and your mother? She gasped, not believing her own words and not believing that the man she'd loved and trusted could do that to her. He was silent again. Talking now was unnecessary. He decided to wait for his wife to yell, let her anger out, and calm down. Then it would be easier to find some common ground with her. This scandal could last for hours, but sooner or later she would stop, so he would have a chance to talk to her, to discuss what to do next. She had no idea that even though he had sold the house, he'd only paid a fifth of the enormous debt that had to be repaid in the shortest possible time. Veronica was in her room, looking out the window. She couldn't think of anything that could help her. She didn't know where to go. Should she go back to the village, to her old friend? Or maybe she really should go to some nursing home where she'd be taken care of. Veronica, your family member's here to pick you up, the doctor said, peering into the room. And he had some strange smile on his face, as if he had stopped feeling sorry for her and was happy for the way the situation was unfolding. Who? She said in surprise, getting up from the bed and feeling much better. I don't know, some girl says she's your relative, but you'll understand as soon as you see her, the doctor said. And Veronica realized that she had no choice. So she put on her robe and headed to the waiting room. But when she came out of her room and saw the very girl who had come to pick her up, she was speechless. She had the same beautiful turquoise eyes as her late husband. She had the same blonde hair and even the same facial features, only much more beautiful, much more feminine. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind, but one thing was clear. She was her husband's daughter. Please, pack up. We'll have time to talk on the way home. I am waiting for you, the girl said. Veronica, without saying anything, decided to trust her fate. She entered her room, packed up her belongings, and walked into the waiting room with this girl, but she still didn't talk to her. Had her husband been cheating on her all this time? She loved him so much. She thought they lived in love harmony, and he lied to her all this time? She couldn't believe that he could do this to her. He was just using her, enjoying a comfortable life, but constantly cheated on her. She got into the car. The car started off. When they left the city, the old lady couldn't stand it. She turned to the girl, but she only smiled. And there was no anger in her smile. There was only some kindness and some realization that no matter how much she delayed this conversation, they would still have to talk. I know, this whole thing will be another blow for you, especially after such a difficult situation. But I'm probably the only person you have left. But I have to disappoint you. I'm not your husband's daughter, she said with a smile, still looking at the surprised Veronica. But you look so much like him, she said, and the girl laughed. Yes, I know, except I don't look like your husband. I look like his brother. You probably didn't even know, but he had a brother he hasn't spoken to in years. They had a terrible fight and never made up, even before he died. He and his brother looked almost like twins, even though they were almost 4 years apart. Anyway, none of that matters anymore. The important thing is that at least we got to know each other. I found out about you through a mutual acquaintance who told me you were in a difficult situation. I learned about your son and immediately went to the hospital to inquire about your body and to bury you with dignity. And it turned out that you were alive, so I just needed to talk to you, the girl said. But please, don't ask me how I found all this out. And then what? I don't want to be a burden and live at your expense, especially since you don't even know me, Veronica said, looking at her. She was so ashamed that she didn't even know her relative, but she was even more ashamed that she suspected her late husband of cheating. I live alone in a big village. I have a spacious house and a dog, but don't worry, my dog is very kind and friendly. Also, I have a big garden. You will always have a place to be near me, and a place to spend some time alone if you get tired of my company. I live alone. Recently I decided it would be better this way, so your company would be good for me. Don't worry, everything will be fine, she said with a smile. But why did you decide to help me? You don't even know me. It turns out I'm not even your blood relative, Veronica wondered. She was very surprised because, after all, even her son had simply abandoned her, choosing to stand up for his wife, who wanted to poison her to get the inheritance. And then a girl who didn't even know her came to pick her up and take her home to live the rest of her life with her? You know, my father was a very cruel man. Your husband didn't tell you, but he used to come to us often. He always protected me, always stood up for me, and treated me much better than my father. And my uncle, your husband, always spoke of you with such love, such tenderness, that I always wanted to meet you. Even though we are not blood relatives, it seems to me that you and I can become a real family, she said. Less than a month after they started living together, under the same roof, they realized they could run a household together without quarreling, and just enjoy each other's company. And every day, Veronica would wake up and thank this girl for inviting her without even knowing her. She almost didn't think about her son, because all her thoughts were focused on her new home, her life, and her savior. And she just tried not to think about Albert. Her whole life changed dramatically, but most importantly, she found a real family, even though it wasn't a blood family.